Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. And today I'm going to be talking about indie dev Cosmo Gatto's miniature life sim, Aka, which tasks you with caretaking a quartet of islets. That said, was this Red Panda flavored romp a rad time, or was it barely passable? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. And yes, I know red pandas aren't actually bears. The war has finally ended, bringing with it a promise of peace to the Red Panda warrior Aka. More importantly, the keepsake letter from his friend promises the possibility of a home once he finds his way over to the islands. Only, it's not quite that simple, because as much as Aka desires to simply settle down, he finds himself haunted by the ghosts of his past, quite literally. And so he sets out to do his best to face those demons, even as he attends to the remnants of wars that might otherwise mar his newfound home. Now, some of this is told to you in the game's opening moments as Aka makes his way to the island to meet his old friend, but the rest slowly unfurls as our Red Panda protagonist begins to make his way around the islands, chatting to the other inhabitants. And that really does sum up the pace of the story, as it's wholly reliant on you wandering around and meeting and chatting up random people, occasionally garnering the odd errand to run. Execution-wise, it's a relatively simple free-form experience that is well suited to aimless exploration, especially given that the game doesn't really provide you much insofar as hints as to who you could or should be talking to. An element that's especially noticeable when it comes to the literal phantoms of Aka's past. Not only are these characters solely able to be seen at night, I never quite discerned a pattern in how they appeared, something which often obliged me to backtrack across the 4 islands and scour their far reaches to see if a formerly unoccupied area was suddenly possessed by a poltergeist. Frankly, the only hint I did have came from a certain room in Bamboo Island, which does you the courtesy of tracking how many ghosts you still need to help. Sadly, it's still a bit of a cold comfort since it does little to save you time in what winds up being the game's central narrative thread. Which is a shame, really, since while the storytelling isn't overly complex, it still provides a genuinely touching look at a traumatized soldier's struggle to try and come to terms with his wartime past and find some semblance of inner peace. These rough edges, though, don't simply end at the narrative front. Like I said, the primary manner in which the story proceeds is by wandering the islands, talking to people, and doing various odds and ends, such as farming, gathering, and crafting. Which sounds quaint until you realize just how much these events boil down into bits of busy work and wasting time. For instance, some quests will require you to engage with gardening, and it's just such a lengthy process, in part because your only source of seeds tend to be very specific spots on the islands, or trading in junk at a specific NPC in order to get a random seed, both of which are somewhat time-consuming processes, and whilst you can hope for seeds when a specific vegetable is finished growing, not everything drops seeds. I'm looking at you, carrots. Whatever you choose to do, you're still limited in the amount you can actually get done in a day, leading to a lot of iterative actions as you slowly extend your garden out and hope to God that one of these quests finally ends. And the actual process of growing anything is, as I said, a fairly time-consuming endeavor that actually saw me sleeping away vast chunks of in-game time as though I was a narcoleptic. The worst part about all this, however, is the fact that the button for eating a given fruit or vegetable has an incredibly nasty habit of overlapping with your mouse icon while you move things around in your inventory. Which means it's entirely plausible to spend something like 5 in-game days nurturing a cabbage, onion, or carrot, and then eating the damn thing when you try to move it. A necessity, incidentally, because your inventory space is not only somewhat limited when you start, but also a bit janky. Mostly, the jank comes from the game really hating it when you try and move things from your storage into your inventory. It just refuses to collapse things into a pre-existing stack oftentimes, while insultingly force-feeding you your hard-earned prizes if you're especially unlucky. Suffice to say, a few of the early quests took a considerable amount of time for the worst possible reasons, and I absolutely dreaded fussing with my inventory. Admittedly, things aren't quite as bad as they used to be, because there was a recent patch that eschewed a particular quest I was forced to do. Specifically, prior to the most recent patch, you couldn't travel between islands freely until you completed a gardening/cooking segment, which effectively served to bar you from the majority of the game for a considerable amount of time. Which was a shame because the game does get a fair bit better after that point. I legitimately enjoyed exploring new islands and poking around their nooks and crannies for the occasional hidden room. That said, as much as you also now have a much broader array of tasks to do and access to more resources, a vast quantity of the actual quest content simply boiled down to a series of fetch quests, to the point that locating and breaking certain items on each island actually felt like a notable change in gameplay. Also, as much as I stated that you got access to a whole bunch of new resources, you also get a whole lot of new recipes that I never actually found a purpose for beyond I can make a taco now. So you can imagine my relief when I discovered that there was a card game to sink my teeth and time into. Admittedly, it's a bit like being thrown into the deep end of a pool, since the game never really bothers to explain how it works or what any of the symbols in the cards mean, but once I got my clock cleaned, I managed to piece together a decent idea of what was going on and managed to wipe the floor with all the would-be card sharks scattered around the various islands. Ironically, this was my favorite bit of content, even if there wasn't much of it. And even though I couldn't see or modify my deck, I still took a bit of solace and satisfaction out of acquiring new cards from NPCs I'd befriended. It certainly treated me nicer than the music minigame, though that one is mostly because I'm currently stuck on mouse and keyboard, and by extension, the lousy keybinds. I imagine the experience would have been nicer on a controller, but mine's finally given up the ghost and is thus locked in a state of permanent joystick drift. In any case, this has been a relatively decent summary of what I was doing during the gameplay, with a whole lot of time spent on loading screens because a number of the quests have different steps on different islands, requiring you to shuffle back and forth several times. Maple Island stands out especially as a bit of a dickish move, since it asked me to find a warm hat while I was wearing a whole-ass fluffy slipper on my head. Just... ugh. Really, the only thing more insulting than that was the simple fact that if an NPC is standing too close to something you need, it basically became impossible to grab it since they have somewhat wide dialogue boxes. Which is then made even worse because if you try and click through their dialogue, you might just get stuck in a bit of a loop until it finally allows you to disengage. And this actually applies to basically any interactable object on the ground. If you have things that are too close to each other, you will often find yourself grabbing at the thing that is adjacent to it, such as a vegetable you can't harvest yet, which is preventing you from picking up a vegetable you can. Still, as much as I have my grievances with the gameplay, to the point that it undermined the idea of relaxing, I will give the game credit on a graphical front. It's quite cute, with the various small islands providing quaint biomes to explore, replete with adorable characters. Also, Akka manages to look like both a grizzled warrior and a complete dork once I realized he had different animations for sequential jumps. It's sort of fantastic, actually. Though not quite as much as the scenes which unlocked after finishing the various ghost quests. It's actually quite rewarding to have these lovely images play out after you reach pivotal moments in the game, especially since the game's soundtrack tries its best to establish a soothing ambience. Unfortunately, it was a bit of an uphill battle, because the further I proceeded into the game, the more I felt my nerves fray from the sheer weight of the busy work I was engaging with. I think it says a bit when portions of the game felt like they had to be resolved by repeatedly sleeping days away in order to pass time, because of a pivotal objective being time-locked, or even a relative lack of anything engaging left to do. For instance, before I finally stepped away from the game, the last thing I had left to do was an excessive farming quest. And I do mean excessive, since in the midst of writing this review, I actually went back to that quest to see if I could finish it, and another 36 in-game days of gardening and feeding vegetables to dragons passed by to no avail. Other than that, the only thing I had to do to occupy my time was click at a number of NPCs who never got dialogue but seemed interactable, in the hopes they might decide to someday provide me a quest or something. Also, to harass a fortune teller who continued to hint that ghosts still existed in the game even after I exorcised all of them. There were also some other smaller elements that rankled me. For instance, the inventor has a small minigame, a pair of marble mages you can engage with in order to unlock their card. That said, the second maze is identical to the first other than it being mirrored. Essentially, it was filler, and it's on that note that I really think my issue with Akka solidifies. So much of my experience with it feels like filler, stacked around the actual story and experience it wants to tell. Yes, there's something nice about roving about its various environments, but ultimately feels like a lackluster affair, and one I'm not sure I can ultimately recommend. And that's why I'm ultimately rating it a fumble, and even then, only barely. Without the gating preventing you from traveling through the islands, a lot of the questing exploring is now a lot more accessible, allowing the experience to breathe and actually be a bit more relaxing, but even then, it still wasn't for me. The only thing that kept me going was ghost hunting, and ultimately, once I'd resolved that, I was happy to hang my hat up. Still, this is a hell of a lot better than Mists of Noia, so I mean, I can say that for it. Also, as a general PS, if you do try this game and find your left mouse button stops being recognized by the game, you can press F to interact with characters and choices, just so you don't wind up grumpy and, like me, and soft-locked on a distant island with nothing to do until someone tells you how to do this. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's also a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.